Hello, everyone, and welcome to Something to Talk About Live. My name is Liz Owen. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the Director of Communications at PFLAG National. Great to have you with us for another episode of Something to Talk About Live. We have a very hot topic today, and I definitely want to get to it, especially because we're covering this hot topic with solutions, really critical solutions. So without wasting any more time, let me introduce my good friend and colleague, our Director of Learning and Inclusion, Jean Marie Nevada.
Liz Owen.
Jean Marie Nevada. I feel like it's not a day if I don't say it that way, all one word.
Just so you know, when I email you, your name comes up all as one word. I'm incapable of just using your first name anymore.
You auto-correct to Jean Marie Nevada on my phone. I think you need to know that.
The longest autocorrect in the history of autocorrect. So we are talking about Twitter today and social media. And you know, I'm not a huge fan of the Twitter or the social media.
Just the fact that you call it the Twitter tells our audience exactly.
It really does. It talks about my deep fear of social media. But you are not fearful of it. So we are going to be talking about social media, what we're learning about it, what people are doing with it, specifically what's happening on Twitter. But even more importantly, to your point, some of the solutions. But I actually wanted to ask you really quickly before we got started, you know, the article that we share this week for Mashable is actually about LGBTQ centers making a decision to leave Twitter because of how bad the situation has become as they've repealed so many of their protection policies. I just wanted to quickly check in with you. So what is your take on this? Because you spend an inordinate amount of time managing what is happening in that space, as does your team. Could you just talk a little bit about the plus and minus in your mind?
Yeah, it is, as everything is right now, very complicated. You know, since He Who Shall Not Be Named purchased Twitter, it has gotten even worse than it was before. That means protections for traditionally underrepresented and often marginalized communities don't have those protections anymore. Reporting structures where we used to be able to, if you see something, say something, immediately come back with does not go against our guidelines. The reason being they seem not to have any guidelines, particularly where these, communities are concerned. We're, of course, in our space seeing it around trans folks in the trans community. Trans and non-binary people are being hit especially hard, communities of color. And then, of course, the cross-section of those communities being hit especially hard. And of course, the more it gets ratcheted up there with, the rhetoric, the more we are seeing the real world violence that it is leading to. You see it on Twitter, you hear the hateful comments, and then Proud Boys show up at your PFLAG meetings. Yeah. That is a thing that is happening. And of course, we are not the only, sorry, that was not me trying to make it go away. That was a bug. It is harmful and it is horrible. And so there are many organizations that are making decisions to leave that platform. It is certainly something we've had a conversation about here at PFLAG and what that means at PFLAG National. Where we have landed, at least for today, everything is day by day, is that to leave the platform, first of all, leaves an open space, right, for just bad information. So if the good folks, right, if the protective folks leave, it just leaves that platform wide open for the misinformation to continue and for no one there to be the folks who have the backs of these communities, for PFLAG to be able to step in and say, no, we are still here to ally up the way we need to. So at the moment, we have made a decision to stay. We spend not one penny of our money there, and we won't. That's, that blue, we have lost our blue check mark, but that doesn't mean we aren't still PFLAG National. We are and have always been for 50 years exactly who we say we are. We will never spend our money on that because that would be $1,000 a month that, quite frankly, is going to the actual work. So as with everything, sorry, that was a very long, complicated monologue, but that is the current state of affairs as far as we are concerned with Twitter.
Liz, I think you made a point that I hadn't really considered literally until this minute, which is you mentioned allyship and that there are some of us who can be in that space in a different way than those who are being marginalized directly. And I think it really does speak for those who can be in that space and who can show that allyship, because not everybody can. And we are really very much focusing today on some of the damage that is being done there. So I think it's complicated, but the good news, there is a little bit of good news, is that we have two amazing guests who are going to talk us through some of what's happening and also what we need to know about that. So I'm going to go ahead and bring them in now.
Excellent. And yeah, I just want to thank them before I hop out, because social media and online and virtual and digital can be harmful, but these guests are creating work and spaces and doing the deep dive on virtual digital resources and places and communities that are just counterbalancing that in such a critical way. So I'm going to hop out and let them speak for themselves more about that.
So thank you, Liz. So we kind of got our start going already. But for those of you who I haven't met yet, my name is Jean Marie Nevada. My pronouns are she and Aya. And I'm the Director of Learning and Inclusion at PFLAG National. Every single week, we're talking about something important related to our community. And this week is very much about social media. So without any further ado, I'd love to bring in our two guests to help us find some solutions here. First, I'm bringing in Deborah Levine, who is the Chief Program Officer at Centerlink and the founder of QChat Space, and Dr. Angela Patterson, who is the head writer and editor at Springtide Research. Deborah and Dr. Patterson, it is so good to see you both.
Jean Marie, so glad to be here.
I really appreciate you being here, and I appreciate this conversation. So before we get started, really quickly, could you, and maybe we can start with Deborah and then go to Angela, tell people very quickly about the organizations that you represent in this conversation.
Absolutely. So thanks very much for having me here. Again, it's Deborah. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm at Centerlink. Centerlink is a nonprofit that serves other nonprofits. Those are LGBT centers throughout the United States, Canada, and beyond. We have a membership network of 326 centers, actually, and our mission is to support, strengthen, and connect them. And of course, many of them are in the online space, and we also have a program called QChat Space that is an online space, a safer online space for LGBTQ teens. So that's Centerlink and QChat Space.
Thank you. And Angela?
So I'm so thrilled to be here representing Springtide Research Institute. And we are a sociological research institute that studies the inner and outer lives of people under 25. So we look at everyone from ages 13 to 25 to understand how culture, belief, all elements of their lives impact how they're maturing, growing up, moving forward.
And some of the research, all of it actually, but especially I was looking at some of the religious identity research is so fascinating, and you're doing so many interesting things. So Deborah, let's start with you. So, we started by talking about Twitter and that the fact that Centerlink, along with a huge number of your centers, decided to get off of Twitter because what is going on there. Do you want to just talk a little bit sort of about what that decision, how you came to that decision and sort of what some of that feedback has been so far?
Absolutely. So certainly it wasn't an easy decision. It's been something we've been talking about and thinking about for quite a while. But the most recent event that really precipitated this was the quiet removal of the policy that was aimed at protecting trans folks from being misgendered and dead named. And particularly in the climate today, what's going on with over 430 pieces of legislation targeting the trans folks and the LGBTQ community, we just felt that it was something we needed to step away from. And in addition, Elon Musk himself has recently promoted, and over time has promoted anti-trans tweets, and it felt like the right decision for us at this point.
Yeah, it really was a hard decision because it is a huge communications tool. And yet it's very interesting as I go to different center websites. I even went to my local one and that account's no longer there. And I thought, what a really powerful statement that is. That we're not, and I think you also made a really important point that so many of these changes have actually happened very much behind the scenes and under the radar. And I think that a lot of people don't realize how severe the impact of these decisions actually has been. And yet we also know that digital spaces often connect people, and especially among LGBTQ youth, that becomes particularly relevant, in terms of connecting with people and getting this sense of belonging. And we're really realizing how important that sense of belonging is. Even the Surgeon General this week was talking about it, and part of the platform that he announced was looking at digital spaces. So Angela, can you tell us a little bit about the connection between some of these mental health challenges we are seeing among LGBTQ youth and sort of their digital existence?
Absolutely. Online spaces are such a double-edged sword for LGBTQ young people. And it's one of the main ways probably over the last 25 years, increasingly, that they can find accurate information on exploring their identities or learning how to navigate same-sex relationships, or most importantly, building community with those people having the same experience. So these spaces are often a lifeline for validation, for acceptance, for support of all kinds. And they help these young people discover who they are and how to express themselves, which is crucial for mental health. And these same spaces can be filled with bullying and hate, with unrealistic images of bodies, inflated ideas about what you have to say and do in this world in order to be worthy of attention. There's a lot of prior social science research that does show how digital spaces can harm mental health, is having the policies that don't accommodate changed identities. That is one of the ways that they can absolutely cause harm. And this is why it makes it all the more important that adults are working to cultivate healthy relationships with young people first and foremost. This is one of the things that Springtide really focuses on, is how to cultivate these relationships, because if there's already a relationship that's built on trust and respect and non-judgment, that young person is more likely to voice when there's going to be cyberbullying, or they're struggling with self-image, or just any of the other problems that they might be having in the space.
You know, and I think you're right. It is very much this double-edged sword, because it does provide that access, that link, that connection. I mean, even think about the time when I grew up where social media was not a thing, and there weren't a lot of ways to find people. There weren't a lot of ways to there was no such thing as building community outside of sort of your own existence in some ways. One more question about this. How do you think it is affecting LGBTQ youth, particularly when they do hear stories about places like Twitter dropping protections that once existed to actually make it a better environment for them?
So I'm going to speak a little more broadly, because I think it encapsulates Twitter and a whole bunch of other groups, spaces, organizations. So anytime there's a decision in a community that even has the perception of minimizing a certain group within that community, members of that group can feel less valued, made to feel like outsiders, etc. And that can pose real psychological harm, because part of good mental health is being able to be your full self and have those around you accept you and value you as such. And when that's not happening, or worse, you see people like you being minimized, discounted, or somehow left unprotected on many fronts, that can be so damaging to one's self-concept, self-worth, and ultimately their mental health. But I think there's something important that we need to recognize about these protocols that actually go beyond the people or groups that are targeted. When an organization has protocols or safeguards like this in place, it signals to everyone else in that community that this particular thing or value or behavior is important in this community. So when those things are taken away, not only does it perhaps make the person feel, the person impacted feel devalued somehow, it also signals to the rest of the population of that group that this thing is no longer important, which then can impact how that targeted group is seen by everyone else.
Wow.
So removing these kinds of protocols can have implications that are far more reaching than just the people who they impact the most.
Thank you. That's fascinating. As you're saying it, I'm like, oh my goodness, what a sense of a loss of agency. You weren't involved in the question. People, it's the message. I hadn't even thought about it that broad. Thank you so much for that. Now, on the good side, we have some great digital spaces, which is, Deborah, we want to definitely talk about QChat Space. So could you tell people a little bit about what it is and sort of what the genesis of it was? Why did it need to exist? Why did this become such a focus for Centerlink?
Absolutely. So to start with what it is, QChat Space basically replicates in some ways what happens at LGBT centers for young people. There are drop-in spaces, there are support groups, there are social programs, and what we've done is really put that into an online space and shaped it in such a way so it'll be a safer space. And what that looks like is we host chats. They're all typing. Nobody sees each other or hears each other, so young people can be anonymous, and they can explore their identity, and they can connect with other people like them. But it's in a space that's always facilitated by two adults. It's always a group space, like it is at the LGBT centers when they have drop-in or support programs. And those two adults who work at LGBT centers, all of the folks who facilitate chats, work at LGBT centers, they structure the conversation around topics we know are important for youth to explore, as well as around topics we know will bring in youth. So a good example of that is a chat about media representation of the LGBTQ population.
Yeah.
You know, it's fun to talk about anime and video games and movies, but it's also important for young people to think about and take a step back and reflect on, well, how is my community being represented in these forms of media? And to develop the skills to understand how they can cope with it when it's a negative representation, and build resilience around it as well. So we do cover the gamut in terms of topics. There are a lot of fun topics as well as serious topics, and they're topics that youth present. But ultimately what's happening is it's an online safer space where young people can connect with each other, find community, and build a positive sense of their LGBTQ identity. And it really, the genesis of it really gets to what Angela spoke to, is that, you know, young people need this. They need this space. Many of them don't have it in their communities, or it's not accessible, or they're not ready yet to go to those places, even if they exist in their community. So finding that online is really important. And of course, we know young people are going online already. And there are a lot of spaces where they don't have the additional protections that we're able to provide in QChat space.
I love the fact that it's not just social connection, but there's also this sort of skill component that is coming out of it. I think that is a really fascinating concept. And it especially seems important to me, given the fact that we constantly are seeing more and more restrictions placed on our lives, especially in school. So that is not, it wasn't being taught. It's not, definitely not being taught now. And here is another opportunity to get it to people, to young people in a really important way. And one more question on that. What kind of issues are you seeing coming up, especially as we're sort of in this arguably post-pandemic phase? Are young people talking about some of the legislation that they are seeing and the restrictions that they are seeing? Is that something that you see surfacing on its own?
So it's an interesting question, and you know, in the nature of it's all chat and it's anonymous, we can't then say, well, how come this didn't come up? But because QChat Space launched nationally just a few months before the pandemic actually started, so the nature of the conversations, whether it's changed, is a little hard to tell, because the conversations earlier were relatively small. And with the pandemic, what we saw was a huge increase in the number of youth joining us. We've been, depending on what measure you look at, twice or three times as many young people joining us, as well as organizations coming to us and saying, you know, can we promote this? And we're like, yes, please do. Ultimately, the changes, whether or not youth talk about these things, they do, but it often tends to be on the side. And we see this at the LGBT centers as well, where young people have to navigate spaces and figure out, how do I present myself? Am I going to code switch? Who's thinking what about me? If I say it that way, am I going to reveal myself? That's a constant throughout their lives. And the LGBT center and the spaces on QChat Space we've seen is that young people just come and be themselves. They can forget that they're LGBTQ to some degree, because they can put it aside and just talk. Now, of course, we also want them to consider and have those times to reflect and build skills. But what we actually see is there's a lot of just fun and what'd you have for dinner and what are you watching on television, and not necessarily digging in. So when we think this might be a space for them to talk about the legislation, it comes up, but it tends to be more oblique, and there's more references to like, oh yeah, everything that's going on. Like, you know, it's all typing, but you can feel their eye roll, because they just want to have fun and be connected and think about the positive. So it does come up, but not as much as you might anticipate.
That's so fascinating to me. But also, I think that's also fascinating what you just said about they can kind of just show up as who they are, and they don't have to actually be conscious of that code switching, of identity as a potential problem. And what an amazing gift that actually would be. So, Angela, services like QChat provide just one way to make connections. Can you talk a little bit about, because we have a lot of people who are watching and a lot of parents who watch stuff like this, and caregivers and educators, what kind of things should they be looking for in these digital spaces that you think sort of mark safer spaces and healthier spaces for LGBTQ youth? Are there characteristics of some of these places?
Sure. So, you know, in general, LGBTQ youth are gravitating toward digital spaces where some element of identity exploration can happen. Just like Deborah was mentioning, how can I explore my identity? How can I express my identity? How can I be with people who are also doing the same thing? So I came across this research that I thought might be helpful for this. So there was a research team led by Shelley Craig. She's at the University of Toronto. And they were doing some work around how social media in particular enhances well-being for what they term gender and sexual minority youth. And so they were actually trying to develop a questionnaire of sorts. That aside, they came across some really interesting findings on characteristics that positively impact well-being for LGBTQ young people in these spaces. So you want to look for spaces that they are able to make genuine personal connections with people, spaces where they can curate the representation of themselves, spaces where they can see content that they see themselves reflected in, or that they're able to see themselves reflected in other people's experiences that are being shared. And perhaps the jury's kind of still out on this one research-wise, but I think it's worth mentioning. Spaces where they can be active producers and consumers. And here's why this could be important. Prior social science research has definitely shown that the more active social media use young people have, it helps them to engage more directly, and that helps well-being, more so than the passive nature of just kind of scrolling or watching videos. That said, the nature of these platforms is always changing. And so this binary between active and passive is changing because a lot of the way that we're interacting on these platforms now is actually a mix of active and passive engagement, like watching an Instagram live, but you can still comment. So it's the combination of both. So we'll just have to wait and see how this combination of active and passive interaction serves young people in terms of their well-being. There was one that this study didn't mention, but I think it's important, is the access to privacy settings. How can they control who they friend and unfriend? Who can see their content? That gives them control over their whole disclosure experience, their identity experience, all of it.
I think that's so interesting. And that, thank you for mentioning that research. One quick follow-up question on that. For caregivers, for educators who are sort of trying to take care of these young people in these spaces, should they be checking in with them? Should they be, because it's kind of that fine line of you don't want to be hanging over someone's shoulder, but we know there are a lot of challenges out there. Should that check-in happen? And what should it sound like?
Absolutely. So this goes back to Springtide's work on trusted adults and helping to form those strong relationships. Because if you have those strong relationships going in, it makes these conversations about digital space and what's happening in digital spaces so much easier because there's already a foundation of trust. That said, for those working directly with LGBTQ young people or young people in general, 24/7 monitoring isn't the answer, as you mentioned, and removing the young person from these spaces is also not going to solve any problems that might come up because the digital space is so intertwined in young people's lives now. There's not the delineation that was there when you or I were younger, right? And so what happens in these spaces, especially some of the social aspects, are what it is part of what it means to grow up in this world now. So one of the most effective steps that any adult can take is to help young people be digitally savvy and know how to be safe on the internet. Just like we have consumer safety protections, we're seeing more and more about how to be digitally safe in this space. The beautiful part is this is how adults can really empower young people because we have to allow them to have some agency and to be able to advocate for themselves. This is going back to the skill building part. They don't have to accept every follower. If somebody is harassing them, they should know how to report it to all channels. To understand what those privacy settings are so they can maintain their experience. Adults can help them navigate these spaces to make sure that all of those safety protocols and triggers are in place so that they can have the safest experience possible, but it's really up to them to learn how to navigate these spaces.
Thank you. And Deborah, sort of to follow up on that, you mentioned that all of the QChat spaces are facilitated. So are the facilitators looking out for some of the things that tend to go a little bit off the rails? And I'm assuming, will they intervene if something seems to be a little problematic?
Absolutely. So we even have conversations about how to use social media and how to interact and use digital spaces. So we attempt to have those conversations with the youth in that space. And the facilitators have developed relationships. Even though it's anonymous, they have a username. They come back week after week so we can have those conversations. And in terms of the safety within QChat space and how we navigate that. So for example, it's rare that youth actually do this, but sometimes youth want to connect outside of QChat space. So they might share social media handles. And ultimately, we do have a message that we send that says, that does some of that educating, that says, we want you to connect. That's the purpose of this, but we also want you to be thoughtful and careful about it. And so it is coming up. And in addition, I think the way that we've structured the space, because it's always a group chat, because it's not social media, they're not creating content and sharing with each other. They're just in the same digital space at the same time and interacting around the same topic. So we've sort of swapped off all of the parts of social media that are a little bit harder to manage and created a structured, somewhat with some scaffolding, a space for youth to be themselves and just interact in a more organic and immediate way, so that we don't have to necessarily coach them in all of the ways that they could do it. Hopefully, I have a 13-year-old and we share conversations. I sometimes say I'm grappling with whether or not to share this on social media and how, and having those conversations. And so similarly, the adults who are in that space are modeling for young people as well.
I love that. And I love that it feels to me, as you describe the environment, it's much more of a gentle touch. And it's an educational way. It's the guiding, not telling, and certainly not pushing or shoving. So we are unfortunately getting close on time. So we try to end the show the same way every day, which is giving people something to do or suggesting a great resource to people. So maybe Angela, we can start with you on this one. Can you suggest to people a resource that you think they should be checking out around this, or perhaps some more information that they should follow up on and how they can get to it?
Absolutely. So Springtide has a number of reports on young people and how they're dealing with mental health, belonging, relationships, all sorts of issues. Most recently, we just released a guide just for parents about mental health and young people. It helps them to understand what some of the trend lines that we're seeing. It helps them go through their own childhood and to understand how they were parented might be impacting how they're parenting. And it also dives into how they can create home environments that are mentally health friendly. So they can find that parents guide at springtideresource.org.
Perfect. And Deborah, what about you? Give us a good resource and a way to get there.
Well, certainly I've spoken about QChat space, and I do encourage the folks listening to consider the young people in your life. It's for teens, 13 to 19. Encourage them to visit QChat space and join a chat. But we also know that some youth are not necessarily interested in live chatting, might be still shy about it. And so we actually have a new resource. This June will be a year out. It's IMI.guide. That's IMI.guide. And it's a self-serve interactive mental health tool that we developed with Hope Lab and in partnership with It Gets Better. And that's another great way for adults to let folks know about a resource that maybe is a lower threshold for use. It's a great, really, you have to check it out, basically, IMI.guide.
I love that. Oh, look, and we already have it on the scroll. Liz helped us out with that one. It's amazing, the things that happen with us not touching. Thank you so much, both of you. I have to tell you, it's when we have conversations like this, I think about my own youth and growing up, and I think about how very different it would have been had I had access to the research that you're talking about, the guides, the sites like QChat Space. Thank you both so much for everything that you're doing, and thank you for spending a little bit of time with us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We'll see you soon. Well, that wraps up yet another show. Definitely come back and join us next week for another fabulous conversation. Check out those resources from today's show. Share them with people, especially if you know people who are taking care of LGBTQ youth. We end this show the exact same way every single week, reminding you to do 3 things, and those are to run fast, laugh hard, and most of all, please be kind. If you need help, visit us at pflag.org. We'll see you next week on Something to Talk About Live.